behind the wholesome facade of 1950s Milwaukee, Happy Days harbored secrets stranger than fiction. From actors terrified of their iconic props to characters who vanished into TV oblivion, the beloved sitcom spawned cultural phenomena while hiding bizarre production mishaps, casting chaos, and a merchandise lawsuit that would make even the Fonz lose his cool. The show that gave us leather jackets and Jumping the Shark was far weirder behind the scenes than anyone imagined. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Happy Days 1974. Fact 1. The Fonz never actually rode his motorcycle. The coolest character on television had a secret that would have shattered his tough guy image. Henry Winkler, who played Arthur Fonzarelli, was absolutely terrified of motorcycles and never actually rode his iconic 1949 Triumph during filming. This fear wasn't just a minor concern but stemmed from a genuinely frightening accident that happened early in the show's production, when Winkler nearly mowed down the director of photography during what should have been a simple scene. The incident occurred during the first season when Winkler was asked to perform what seemed like a straightforward task: rev the motorcycle engine and drive it forward about 5 feet. However, Winkler became confused by the bike's controls and accidentally sent the motorcycle shooting forward at high speed, forcing the director of photography to leap out of the way to avoid being hit. As Winkler later recalled on The Jennifer Hudson Show in 2023, "He leapt out of the way. I put the bike down. We slid under the truck on the soundstage, and they came running. Everybody was like in a panic that the bike was fine because it was rented. And then they said, 'How about you? Are you okay?' After this terrifying experience, Winkler refused to ride the motorcycle again. But the show's producers came up with a clever workaround that fooled audiences for years. They mounted the bike on a wooden platform with 4 rubber wheels and attached it to the back of a truck, allowing Winkler to sit on the motorcycle while crew members pulled him along. This technique created the illusion that Fonzie was cruising through Milwaukee, when in reality Winkler was simply acting while being towed by a vehicle. The deception was so effective that Winkler later asked audiences, "Did I not look like I was riding it?" The answer was clearly yes. Viewers had no idea that television's coolest character was actually getting around on what amounted to a very elaborate movie prop, making Fonzie's motorcycle scenes one of television's most successful illusions. Fact 2. The show created Chuck Cunningham syndrome. Happy Days inadvertently created one of television's most famous phenomena when the eldest Cunningham child, Chuck, mysteriously vanished from the show after season 2 without any explanation, giving birth to the term Chuck Cunningham syndrome, that television critics still use today to describe characters who disappear as if they never existed. Chuck Cunningham was originally conceived as Richie and Joni's older brother, a basketball-playing college student who was supposed to serve as the big brother figure in the family dynamic, but his disappearance became so complete that later episodes would reference the Cunninghams as having only 2 kids, as if Chuck had never been born. The character was actually played by 3 different actors during his brief existence on the show, starting with Rick Carrot in the original pilot episode, then Gavin O'Herlihy for most of Season 1 and part of Season 2, and finally Randolph Roberts for just 2 episodes before Chuck vanished entirely. O'Herlihy, an Irish actor who was the son of veteran performer Dan O'Herlihy, became dissatisfied with the limited scope of his role and approached the producers about leaving the show. As he later explained, he felt like he was only going to grunt and bounce a basketball once every couple of weeks for probably 3 or 4 years, which wasn't the kind of acting career he wanted to pursue. Creator Gary Marshall later revealed that O'Herlihy had come to him saying he wanted to quit and go back to school to become a poet, eventually returning to Trinity College in Dublin. When the second replacement actor also failed to make the character compelling, Marshall made the decision to simply let Chuck disappear rather than continue recasting the role. The timing worked out perfectly because audiences were becoming increasingly fascinated with Fonzie, who naturally filled the big brother role that Chuck was supposed to occupy. The character's complete erasure from the show's continuity became so notorious that Chuck Cunningham syndrome is now the standard term used whenever a television character vanishes without explanation, and is later treated as if they never existed. Fact 3. Robin Williams saved a horrible script. What would become one of television's most beloved episodes started as such a disaster that 3 different actors walked away from the project before Robin Williams transformed it into the career-launching performance that made him a star. The My Favorite Orkin episode of Happy Days was born from creator Gary Marshall's son asking why a spaceman couldn't visit the show after seeing Star Wars, but the resulting script was so poorly written that even the Happy Days cast considered it unusable, and ABC executives wanted to throw the entire episode out. The production faced immediate casting problems when British actor Roger Rees, who was originally hired to play the alien Mork, quit after reading the script and realizing how bad it was. The producers then turned to Dom DeLuise, who also rejected the role, followed by a third actor who similarly refused to participate. With rehearsals already scheduled to begin, and no one willing to play the character that was supposed to carry the entire episode, the production was in serious trouble, and facing the possibility of scrapping the show entirely. The salvation came when Al Molinaro, who played Al on the show, suggested a fellow acting student named Robin Williams, who included a spaceman bit in his stand-up comedy routine. Williams was brought in for an emergency audition, and when producer Gary Marshall asked him to take a seat, the unknown comedian immediately sat upside down in the chair with his head hanging toward the floor, perfectly embodying the alien character's otherworldly behavior. Marshall was so impressed by this instant demonstration of Williams' quirky comedic talent that he hired him on the spot, later joking that Williams was the only alien who auditioned. Once Williams began working with the material, he transformed the terrible script through his incredible improvisational skills, creating many of Mork's signature mannerisms like drinking through his finger and speaking in alien gibberish on the spot. The writers quickly began revising the script to incorporate Williams' spontaneous ideas, and the cast was so amazed by his performance that they invited everyone around the studio to come watch him work. The episode became such a phenomenon that ABC immediately offered Williams his own series, Mork and Mindy, just 4 days after filming wrapped. Fact 4. Henry Winkler had undiagnosed dyslexia. While Henry Winkler portrayed the supremely confident Fonzie on screen, he was secretly battling a learning disability that made every day of filming an exhausting struggle, as he suffered from severe undiagnosed dyslexia throughout the entire run of Happy Days, and wasn't properly diagnosed until he was 31 years old. This hidden condition meant that Winkler couldn't read scripts at a normal pace, couldn't spell properly, and had such difficulty with basic tasks that he didn't even know how to count change when paying for things with cash. Yet he had to maintain the illusion of being television's coolest character while feeling deeply ashamed of his academic struggles. The impact on his work was enormous, as Winkler had to request his scripts weeks earlier than other cast members, so he could read them over and over again until he had memorized every line, which put extra pressure on the writing staff, who were already working under tight deadlines, to produce 24 scripts per season. During table reads, which are standard practice where the entire cast sits together and reads through the script aloud, Winkler would feel humiliated and terrified because his reading difficulties were apparent to everyone present, though his fellow cast members were understanding and supportive rather than judgmental about his struggles. In his memoir, Being Henry, Winkler described the shame and frustration he felt during this period, explaining that he had always been told he was simply not trying hard enough in school when the reality was that his brain processed information differently than others. When he finally received his dyslexia diagnosis at age 31, Winkler wasn't relieved, but actually became angry, saying, "When I found out that I had something with a name, I was so angry because he realized how much pain and self-doubt could have been avoided if the condition had been identified earlier in his life." Despite these challenges, Winkler never let his learning disability affect his commitment to the show, and his castmates never knew the full extent of his daily struggle to simply read and memorize his lines while maintaining Fonzie's effortlessly cool persona. Fact 5. The cast sued CBS for $1,010 million. Nearly 3 decades after Happy Days ended, 5 cast members filed a $10 million lawsuit against CBS in 2011 after discovering that their faces were being used on casino slot machines without receiving any of the promised merchandising payments from their original contracts. The legal battle began when 83-year-old Marion Ross, who played Marion Cunningham, received a phone call from a friend who was gambling at a casino and noticed a Happy Days slot machine that featured Ross's image, with the jackpot triggered by rolling 5 Marion Rosses in a row. This discovery led the actors to contact CBS directly to inquire about merchandising payments they believed they were owed. But the network allegedly told them that no money was due, prompting Marion Ross, Anson Williams, who played Potsy, Don Most, who played Ralph Malph, Erin Moran, who played Joni, and Patricia Bosley, representing her late husband Tom Bosley, to file their lawsuit in Los Angeles Superior Court. According to their contracts, the actors were supposed to receive 5% of net proceeds when their individual images were used on merchandise, or 2.5% when they appeared as part of a group, but they claimed they had never received proper accounting statements or payments for years of merchandising that included comic books, t-shirts, trading cards, lunchboxes, dolls, magnets, greeting cards, and DVD covers featuring their likenesses. The case revealed that CBS had been profiting from Happy Days merchandise for years while the actors received nothing. And the lawsuit accused the network of fraud, breach of contract, and intentionally withholding payments that were rightfully owed. Notably, the show's 2 biggest stars, Ron Howard and Henry Winkler, were not part of the lawsuit, likely because they had different contract arrangements or had already resolved their merchandising issues separately. After more than a year of legal proceedings, the case was settled just 10 days before it was scheduled to go to trial in July 2012, with each of the 5 cast members receiving approximately $65,000, along with promises that CBS would honor their merchandising contracts going forward. Fact 6. Pat Morita's accent was forced and fake. Pat Morita, who played Arnold the drive-in owner on Happy Days, spoke perfect unaccented English as a California-born Japanese-American actor, but network executives forced him to adopt an exaggerated and completely fake Chinese accent because they believed an obviously Asian character should sound stereotypically foreign to television audiences. Before filming his first scene as Arnold, director Jerry Paris reluctantly approached Morita and told him that the network higher-ups had decided he needed to pick an accent, despite the fact that Morita had been speaking flawless American English his entire life and had no natural accent whatsoever. Morita reluctantly agreed to the network's demands and began performing Arnold using an over-the-top Chinese pidgin English dialect that bore no resemblance to his actual speaking voice, creating a completely artificial character trait that existed solely because executives thought Asian actors should sound different from other Americans. The situation became even more absurd about 6 weeks later when Paris returned to Morita, this time accompanied by a standards and practices representative from the network, to inform the actor that he could no longer play Arnold because the character was obviously Chinese-American based on his accent. But Morita himself was Japanese-American, which the network now considered politically incorrect. Faced with losing his job over this ridiculous bureaucratic logic, Morita had to think quickly and came up with a creative solution on the spot, explaining to the network representatives that Arnold's last name was actually Takahashi, and that the character was the product of a Japanese father and Chinese mother, which would justify both his appearance and the fake accent they had forced him to adopt. This explanation satisfied the network executives and allowed Morita to keep his role, though it meant he had to continue performing with the completely artificial accent for the remainder of his time on the show. The entire situation highlighted the absurd racial stereotyping that was common in 1970s television, where network executives assumed that Asian actors couldn't simply play normal American characters without adopting exaggerated speech patterns that reinforced outdated and offensive cultural assumptions. Fact 7. The show was almost called cool. Before Happy Days became one of television's most beloved sitcoms, creator Gary Marshall originally wanted to call the series Cool because he believed this simple one-word title perfectly captured the 1950s rock and roll atmosphere that he was trying to recreate for audiences. In the 1970s, Marshall felt that the word cool immediately evoked the era's rebellious spirit, leather jackets, hot rods, and the emerging youth culture that would define the decade the show was meant to portray, making it an ideal way to signal to viewers what kind of nostalgic experience they could expect from tuning in each week. The title, Cool, would have certainly fit with the show's focus on characters like Fonzie, who embodied everything that the word represented in both the 1950s setting and the contemporary understanding of what made someone effortlessly appealing and confident. Marshall's instinct to use such a direct and immediately recognizable term showed his understanding that the show needed to quickly communicate its tone and time period to potential viewers who might be channel surfing and deciding whether to stick around for the full episode. However, somewhere during the development process, Marshall and his team ultimately decided that cool might be too limiting or perhaps too obvious for a show that wanted to explore broader themes of family, friendship, and growing up in small-town America during the Eisenhower era. The decision to change the title to Happy Days proved to be inspired, as it suggested not just the coolness factor that Marshall originally wanted to emphasize, but also the warmth, nostalgia, and idealized vision of American family life that became the show's true emotional core. The final title, Happy Days, also worked better with the show's opening theme song, which featured the lyrics, "These are the happy days," and helped establish the nostalgic, feel-good tone that would make the series a cultural phenomenon. While Cool might have attracted viewers initially, Happy Days created a broader emotional connection that helped the show run for 11 successful seasons and spawn multiple spin-offs. Fact 8. Ron Howard joined to avoid Vietnam draft. Ron Howard's decision to accept the role of Richie Cunningham on Happy Days wasn't driven purely by artistic ambition, but was significantly influenced by his desperate need to avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War, as he had just turned 18 and received what he described as a lousy draft number that made military service almost inevitable. At the time Howard was cast in 1973, the Vietnam conflict was still raging, and young American men were being conscripted through a lottery system that assigned numbers based on birth dates, with lower numbers meaning a higher likelihood of being called to serve in what had become an increasingly unpopular and dangerous war. Howard had been studying film directing at the University of Southern California's School of Cinematic Arts, pursuing his dream of becoming a filmmaker, but his low draft number forced him to consider alternative strategies for avoiding military service that could derail or end his career aspirations entirely. He had read somewhere that individuals whose jobs were directly related to employing 30 or more people could potentially qualify for a military deferment, and he believed that starring in a major television production like Happy Days might provide exactly the kind of employment situation that would protect him from being drafted. As Howard later explained to the Washington Post in 1984, "The war was still going on and I had a lousy number. But I had read somewhere that if your job could be directly related to the employment of 30 or more people, that would be a deferment. I thought, if this series goes, I bet you could get that deferment." This strategic thinking meant that Howard was willing to leave his film school program and commit to what could be several years of television work, not just because he liked the character of Richie Cunningham, but because the role represented his best chance of avoiding military service while continuing to work in the entertainment industry. Howard's plan ultimately worked perfectly, as the military draft ended in 1973, just 1 year before Happy Days premiered, allowing him to pursue both his acting and directing careers without the threat of being sent to Vietnam. Fact 9. Fonzie's leather jacket was initially banned. The iconic black leather jacket that became synonymous with Fonzie's cool image was actually banned by ABC executives during the early episodes of Happy Days because network standards and practices officials feared it would make character look like a dangerous hoodlum rather than the lovable tough guy that audiences would embrace. This concern reflected the conservative television climate of the 1970s, when networks were extremely cautious about anything that might be perceived as promoting rebellious or criminal behavior, and leather jackets carried strong associations with motorcycle gangs and juvenile delinquents that made executives nervous about the kind of message they might be sending to family audiences. Instead of the leather jacket that Henry Winkler and the show's creators knew was essential to Fonzie's character, the network forced him to wear a cloth windbreaker during his early appearances, which completely undermined the tough, rebellious image that made Fonzie appealing and memorable to viewers. The windbreaker made Fonzie look more like a suburban dad than a cool greaser, stripping away the visual elements that communicated his status as someone who lived by his own rules and commanded respect through his confident attitude and street credibility. Gary Marshall and the show's producers knew they had to find a way around this restriction if they wanted Fonzie to become the character they had envisioned, so they developed a clever strategy to convince the network executives that the leather jacket was actually a practical safety requirement rather than a fashion statement. Marshall argued that since Fonzie rode a motorcycle, the leather jacket should be considered essential safety equipment that any responsible motorcyclist would wear to protect themselves from road rash and other injuries in case of an accident. To make this argument even more convincing, Marshall instructed the writers to include Fonzie's motorcycle in every scene where he appeared, ensuring that the leather jacket would always seem like a logical and necessary part of his outfit rather than just a style choice. This approach eventually wore down the network's resistance, and executives finally agreed to let Fonzie wear his leather jacket, creating one of television's most recognizable costume pieces. Fact 10. The Fonz's hair gag was improvised. One of Fonzie's most memorable trademark gestures, reaching up to comb his hair, looking in the mirror, and then shrugging, as if to say his hair was already perfect, was never written in any script but was created spontaneously by Henry Winkler during filming, when he decided to avoid the cliched behavior that television audiences expect from greaser characters. By the time Happy Days was being produced in the 1970s, it had become a tired stereotype for tough guys and hoodlums to constantly be combing their hair on screen, and Winkler felt that having Fonzie follow this predictable pattern would make him look like just another ordinary television bad boy, rather than the unique character he was trying to create. During a scene that called for Fonzie to fix his hair, Winkler made a split-second creative decision to subvert audience expectations by having the character reach for his comb, glance at himself in the mirror, and then stop mid-motion with a casual shrug, that communicated supreme self-confidence. The gesture suggested that Fonzie was so naturally cool that his hair was always perfect without any effort, elevating him above the insecure posturing that other tough guy characters typically displayed when they obsessively groomed themselves to maintain their image. The improvised moment got such a big laugh from the studio audience that the writers and producers immediately recognized it as comedy gold and decided to make it a recurring element of Fonzie's character, turning what started as a one-time creative choice into one of television's most recognizable character traits. The gag became so closely associated with Fonzie that it was referenced throughout the series, including a later episode where Fonzie shows Richie his comb and proudly declares, "Do you know I have had this comb for 9 years, and it has never once touched my hair?" Winkler's instinctive decision to break away from the expected greaser stereotype not only created a memorable comedy bit, but also helped establish Fonzie as a character who was confident enough in his own coolness that he didn't need to constantly prove it through obvious displays of vanity. Fact 11. Milwaukee scenes were shot in Indiana. Despite Happy Days being firmly set in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and constantly referencing the city's local culture and geography, many of the show's exterior scenes were actually filmed hundreds of miles away in Munster, Indiana, creating one of television's most successful geographic deceptions that fooled audiences for decades. Ron Howard later revealed this surprising production secret, explaining that the show's creators found it more practical and cost-effective to shoot outdoor scenes in Indiana rather than travel to the actual Milwaukee locations that the characters were supposedly visiting, even though this meant that the landscapes and architecture viewers saw didn't necessarily match what they would find if they visited the real Milwaukee. The decision to film in Munster, Indiana, was likely driven by budget considerations and scheduling convenience, as television productions in the 1970s often had tight financial constraints that made location shooting expensive and logistically complicated. By using Indiana locations that could reasonably pass for Milwaukee neighborhoods, the producers could create the illusion of authentic Midwest settings without the added costs of transporting cast, crew, and equipment to Wisconsin for what might be just a few minutes of footage in each episode. However, the show's geographic confusion didn't stop there, as eagle-eyed viewers occasionally spotted palm trees visible in the background during scenes that were supposedly taking place in the Wisconsin climate, revealing that some exterior shots were actually filmed on California studio backlots, where tropical vegetation was part of the permanent landscape. These palm trees were completely out of place for a show set in the upper Midwest, where such plants couldn't survive the harsh winters, creating amusing continuity errors that sharp-eyed fans noticed over the years. The presence of California palm trees in supposedly Milwaukee scenes highlighted the challenges that television productions faced when trying to maintain geographic authenticity while working within the practical limitations of studio-based filming, where outdoor sets needed to serve multiple purposes and couldn't always be perfectly tailored to match specific regional characteristics. Fact 12. The show had massive continuity errors. Happy Days was supposed to transport viewers back to the innocent 1950s, but the show was riddled with glaring anachronisms and continuity errors that placed objects and references from decades later right in the middle of scenes that were meant to take place during the Eisenhower era. One of the most obvious mistakes appeared in Fonzie's garage, where viewers could clearly see a Ford Mustang hubcap hanging on the wall as decoration, despite the fact that the first Mustang wasn't manufactured until 1964, nearly a decade after the show's setting, and well into the 1960s cultural period that Happy Days was specifically contrasting with its idealized 50s nostalgia. The anachronisms weren't limited to automotive accessories, as several episodes featured characters wearing digital watches during scenes that were supposed to take place in the late 1950s, when such technology didn't exist and wouldn't be commercially available for another 15 years. These futuristic timepieces appeared on the wrists of various characters, including Mr. Cunningham during important family scenes, creating jarring visual contradictions that sharp-eyed viewers noticed and that undermined the show's careful attention to period costumes and hairstyles in other areas. Arnold's Drive-In, which served as one of the show's primary gathering places and was meant to represent the authentic teenage hangout culture of the 1950s, contained a Nippet pinball machine that was actually manufactured in 1972, making it completely out of place in a setting that was supposed to predate its existence by nearly 2 decades. The pinball machine was prominently positioned in the restaurant and appeared in numerous scenes, yet no one in the production apparently noticed or cared that this particular model couldn't have existed during the time period the show was depicting. These continuity errors highlighted the challenges that period television shows faced when trying to maintain historical accuracy, while working with limited budgets and tight production schedules that made it difficult to verify that every prop, costume, and set decoration was actually appropriate for the intended time period. Fact 13. A fan called threatening suicide. During the height of Happy Days' popularity, Henry Winkler received one of the most frightening phone calls of his career when Paramount Studios connected him with a deeply distressed teenage fan who was contemplating suicide and had specifically requested to speak with his television hero as his final wish. The young boy, who was an aspiring actor himself, had reached such a desperate emotional state that he felt talking to Fonzie was the only thing that might help him reconsider his tragic decision, putting enormous pressure on Winkler to somehow find the right words to save a stranger's life over the telephone. Winkler later admitted that he was terrified to pick up the phone because he had no training in crisis intervention and felt completely unprepared to handle such a serious situation, knowing that whatever he said in the next few minutes could literally mean the difference between life and death for this troubled teenager. Despite his fear and uncertainty, Winkler recognized that he couldn't refuse to help someone who was reaching out in such desperation, so he agreed to take the call and do whatever he could to provide comfort and support to the suicidal fan. During the conversation, Winkler drew upon Fonzie's trademark confidence and unshakable cool demeanor, channeling the character's ability to remain calm under pressure and project strength, even in the most difficult circumstances. Rather than speaking as himself, Winkler essentially became Fonzie during the phone call, using the character's authoritative voice and reassuring presence to connect with the boy, and convince him that his problems could be solved without resorting to self-harm. The strategy worked, and Winkler was able to talk the teenager out of his suicidal thoughts during their lengthy conversation, demonstrating the profound impact that television characters could have on viewers' lives and the unexpected responsibilities that came with portraying beloved figures who served as role models for millions of young people. Winkler later reflected on this incident as one of the most meaningful moments of his career, showing how his portrayal of Fonzie extended far beyond entertainment into real-world situations where the character's strength and wisdom could genuinely help people in crisis. Fact 14. The interior house layout made no sense. The Cunningham family home on Happy Days created one of television's most confusing architectural mysteries, as the interior set design showed doors, windows, and room arrangements that were completely impossible when compared to the exterior shots of the house that viewers saw in establishing shots and outdoor scenes. This spatial contradiction meant that anyone trying to map out the actual layout of the Cunningham residence would discover that the rooms simply couldn't exist in the same building that was shown from the outside, creating a structure that defied basic principles of architecture and physics. The most glaring problem involved the kitchen area, which featured a door leading directly outside that appeared to be located very close to the front entrance on the same side of the house. Yet the exterior shots consistently showed no such door anywhere near the front of the building. The interior set suggested that family members could walk from the kitchen straight out into the yard through this side door, but the exterior facade revealed a solid wall with no opening where this exit was supposed to be located, making it impossible for the door to actually lead anywhere. Additionally, the interior set included windows facing directions that contradicted what the exterior architecture would allow, with some rooms appearing to have natural light coming from walls that were shown to be interior-facing or blocked by other parts of the structure when viewed from outside. The garage and driveway also created continuity problems. As the interior shots suggested, the garage was accessible directly from the house in a certain configuration, while the exterior shots showed the driveway and garage positioned in a completely different relationship to the main building. These architectural impossibilities were typical of television production during the 1970s, when interior and exterior sets were often designed and built completely separately by different teams who didn't always coordinate their work to ensure that the fictional building would make sense as a real structure. The primary concern was creating functional interior spaces for filming scenes with the actors, while the exterior shots were chosen based on finding attractive houses that matched the show's suburban Milwaukee aesthetic, regardless of whether the two elements would actually fit together logically. Fact 15. Fonzie started as background character. Arthur Fonzie. Fonzarelli was originally conceived as nothing more than a minor supporting character who would occasionally appear in the background of scenes at Arnold's Drive-In, but his unexpected popularity with audiences grew so dramatically that network executives eventually wanted to completely rebrand the entire series as Fonzie's Happy Days, or simply Fonzie, fundamentally changing the show's identity around Henry Winkler's breakout performance. When Happy Days first premiered, the show was designed as a showcase for Ron Howard's character Richie Cunningham, with Fonzie serving as little more than a colorful local tough guy who would add some edge to the wholesome family dynamics without ever becoming a central figure in the storytelling. However, audience response to Fonzie was so overwhelmingly positive that the character's role expanded rapidly throughout the first few seasons, with writers giving him more dialogue, more screen time, and increasingly important storylines that often overshadowed the original Cunningham family focus that had been the show's foundation. This shift in audience attention created tension behind the scenes, as Ron Howard found himself being pushed into the background despite being the intended star of the series, while Henry Winkler's credit placement moved from the closing credits in Season 1 to fourth billing in Season 2, then second billing in Seasons 3 through 7, and finally top billing from Season 8 onward. The character's popularity reached such heights that ABC executives approached the producers with a serious proposal to rename the entire show to capitalize on Fonzie's appeal, believing that audiences were tuning in primarily to see the leather-jacketed character rather than the broader ensemble cast and family-friendly storylines. However, this corporate decision sparked a revolt among the existing cast members who felt that changing the show's title would diminish their contributions and fundamentally alter the collaborative spirit that had made Happy Days successful in the first place. The threatened resignations from multiple cast members, including Henry Winkler himself, who recognized that the show's ensemble nature was crucial to its success, forced the network to abandon their rebranding plans and keep the original Happy Days title, demonstrating that even the most popular breakout characters needed the support of a strong ensemble cast to maintain long-term success.